The sun was bleeding its last light over the Sierra Blanca when Ellie Dawson made her final approach to the McAllister homestead. Her boots kicked up dust that clung to the frayed edges of her skirt, and the weight in her chest had nothing to do with the near-empty satchel slung over her shoulder. The ranch house loomed ahead, weathered planks, a porch sagging like an old man's spine, and a fence that had long since given up trying to keep anything in or out. It was a place that had seen better days, but so had Ellie. She didn't bother with a polite knock. 2 sharp raps firm enough to rattle the hinges, and the door groaned open just wide enough to reveal a man with a face like chiseled granite, backlit by a flickering lantern. "Yeah," he grunted, his voice rough as sandpaper. Ellie met his glare without flinching. "Heard you're short a cook." The man, Jed McAllister, she guessed, let out a humorless snort. That so old Pete at the trading post run his mouth again. Behind him the shadows stirred. A boy, maybe 9, stood with his arms crossed in a poor imitation of his father's stubbornness, while a tiny girl with wide, wary eyes clutched a doll missing half its yarn hair. The air inside smelled of cold coffee, burnt bacon, and the quiet desperation of a home running on empty. Ellie didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past Jed, her gaze sweeping the room. The hearth was a graveyard of dead embers, the kitchen a testament to half-hearted effort. A cast-iron skillet sat abandoned near a pile of kindling, battered but salvageable. "Stove work?" she asked, already rolling up her sleeves. Jed's silence was answer enough. 10 minutes later, the crackle of a fresh fire and the scent of cornbread in the making filled the room. The boy Tommy hovered near the stairs, trying hard not to look interested. The girl Lily inched closer, her doll forgotten, as she watched Ellie's hands move with practiced ease. Then came the twist, a sudden clatter from the porch. Jed's hand went to his hip, but it was just a scrawny dog ribs showing sniffing at the door. Ellie didn't hesitate. She tossed a scrap of dough into the dirt, and the mutt scarfed it down like it was his last meal. Jed's jaw tightened. "We ain't running a charity." Ellie shot him a look that could have curdled milk. "Neither am I." For the first time, something flickered in Jed's eyes, not quite respect, but close enough. The dog slunk away, but the tension lingered thick as the heat from the stove. Ellie kept working her back straight, her movements sure. The McAllister homestead might have been on its last legs, but so was everyone out here. And Ellie Dawson hadn't survived this long by waiting for an engraved invitation. Ellie didn't wait for an answer. She just held out the spatula grease still sizzling on the cast iron. "Toby." Jed muttered from the doorway, arms crossed, like he expected the boy to refuse. But Toby's stubbornness wavered when the smell of hot cornbread hit him. He shuffled forward, took the spatula like it was a loaded pistol, and promptly mangled the flip batter, splattering across the hearth like a botched bank robbery. Ellie didn't blink. "Well," she drawled, "that's one way to make a mess. Try it again, cowboy." Behind them, little Lily inched closer, her doll dangling forgotten at her side. Ellie shot her a wink. "You like yours crispy or soft, sugar?" Lily's whisper was barely audible. "Crispy." By the time the last golden cake slid onto the plate, the kitchen felt different, warmer, despite the draft sneaking through the cracks. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the hollow kind. Toby devoured his portion like he'd been starved for years, and Jed's chewing slowed, as if he'd forgotten food could taste like something other than survival. When the plates were clean, Ellie wiped her hands on her apron. "House this big shouldn't echo so much McAllister." Jed's jaw twitched. "Ain't your concern." "Maybe not," she said, stacking the dishes. "But a stove's no good cold, and neither's a man." The words hung there, sharp as a spur. Then a crash outside. Jed was on his feet in an instant, hand on his Colt, but it was just that scrawny dog again, knocking over a bucket in its frenzy to lick cornbread crumbs from the porch steps. Lily gasped and darted forward, but Jed caught her shoulder. That mutt's half coyote, he warned. Ellie didn't hesitate. She tore off a chunk of bread and tossed it into the dirt. The dog wolfed it down, tail wagging like a metronome gone wild. Jed's scowl deepened. We ain't got enough to feed strays. Ellie met his gaze. Funny, I heard the same thing about people. For a heartbeat, the air crackled hotter than the fire. Then Lily tugged free and knelt in the dust, her tiny hand outstretched. The dog licked her fingers, and the girl's laughter cut through the tension like a harmonica at a funeral. Jed exhaled hard, his shoulders dropping just a fraction. That night, as Ellie banked the fire, she caught movement in the doorway. Jed silhouetted against the moonlight, holding out a threadbare blanket. For the couch, he grunted. She took it, their fingers brushing, and for the first time his calloused hands didn't feel like armor. Somewhere outside, the dog howled at the moon, and the sound didn't seem so lonely anymore. Ellie knew the doll's name before Lily even spoke it aloud. She'd heard the girl whisper Sparrow in the dark, the word fragile as a bird's wing. Now, as she flipped bacon in the skillet, she caught Lily's gaze darting between the sizzling pan and the doll's dangling arm. Ellie didn't push. She just let the rhythm of the kitchen work its magic, the hiss of grease, the scrape of her boots on worn floorboards. The house, which had creaked like an old saddle yesterday, now held its breath less. Y'all always this chatty at breakfast, Ellie mused. Or am I just that special? Toby scowled into his plate, but it lacked its usual venom. Lily stayed silent, though her grip on Sparrow loosened just a fraction. Behind her, Jed's voice cut through the quiet like a dull knife. Quiet keeps coyotes from the door. Ellie turned to find him leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, his shadow long and lean against the wall. She poured coffee into his chipped tin cup, the one with the bullet dent near the rim, and slid it across the table. He took it without thanks, but his fingers lingered on the warmth a second too long. The meal passed in a silence that wasn't quite uncomfortable. Toby ate like he was fueling for a cattle drive, while Lily picked at her food-stealing glances at Ellie between bites. Then Sparrow's arm gave its final surrender, dangling by a thread. Ellie didn't hesitate. She reached into her satchel and pulled out her mending kit, a worn leather pouch that had seen more repairs than a frontier doctor's bag. She met Lily's wide eyes and simply held out her hand. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Toby's fork hovered midair. Jed's grip tightened on his cup. Then, with trembling fingers, Lily passed over Sparrow like she was entrusting a kingdom. Ellie's needle moved with the precision of a woman who'd stitched up everything from torn shirts to gunshot wounds. This old bird's been through some storms, she remarked, threading the needle through faded calico. But ain't nothing a few strong stitches can't fix. When she handed Sparrow back, Lily cradled the doll like it was made of gold. Her lips quivered, not quite a smile, but close enough to make Toby abruptly shove back his chair. I'm flipping the next batch, he declared, jutting his chin toward the skillet. Ellie arched a brow but stepped aside. Mind you don't burn down the territory, cowboy. Toby's first attempt sent a pancake sailing onto the hearth. The second landed half-folded like a drunken accordion. But the third, golden perfection. He shot Ellie a grin before remembering to scowl, and even Jed's mouth twitched beneath his beard. Then a knock at the door, hard, authoritative. Jed was on his feet in an instant, hand on his Colt. The kids stiffened. Ellie didn't flinch. She just wiped her hands on her apron and nodded toward the door. Expecting company, Jed's jaw worked. Not the kind that knocks. The rapping came again, louder. A voice barked through the wood. McAllister, open up, sheriff's business. Lily clutched Sparrow to her chest. Toby's bravado faltered. And Ellie. She picked up the cast-iron skillet, like it was just another tool for the day's work. Jed's gaze locked with hers. For the first time, something like trust flickered in his eyes. The door groaned open. The dishes were stacked, The skillet hung back on its nail, but the air in the McAllister kitchen had changed. It wasn't the dead quiet of before now. It hummed low, like a guitar string tuned just shy of snapping. Jed set his coffee cup down harder than necessary. "You think patching dolls and flipping pancakes fixes anything?" His voice was gravel wrapped in barbed wire. Ellie didn't look up from scrubbing the last plate. "I think it's how rebuilding starts," she said. "One stitch at a time." Jed's fingers drummed the table, a restless cattle stampede contained in 5 calloused fingers. "Ought to know the Silver Star outfit's been circling this land like vultures. They don't negotiate. Last rancher who refused, they found his prize stallion shot dead in the corral." The words hung thick between them. Ellie turned dish rag in hand and met his stare. Men like that only understand one language. She nodded to the Winchester leaning by the door. "And it ain't words." For a heartbeat, something dangerous flickered in Jed's eyes, not anger, but recognition. The kind that passed between wolves when they caught the same scent on the wind. He stood abruptly, chair scraping like a gunshot in the quiet. "Fences won't mend themselves," he muttered, snatching his hat from the peg. But when his boots hit the porch, he paused. The thin curl of smoke from the chimney caught his eye. The scent of bacon and cornbread still clung to his clothes. For 3 seconds, Ellie counted the rigid line of his shoulders softened. Inside, Lily had fallen asleep by the hearth, Sparrow clutched to her chest. Ellie knelt to tuck a blanket around her, her fingers brushing the doll's freshly mended arm. "Tough little bird," she whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with a sound like rattlesnake tails. Then it came the smell. Ellie's head snapped up before the first tendril of smoke slithered under the door. Not the clean burn of seasoned oak. This was the acrid stench of greed and gasoline. She was moving before her brain caught up the bowl in her hands, crashing to the floor. McAllister, Jed was already at the door, his body blocking the view of what Ellie already knew was there. But the orange glow painting his face told the story. The barn? No, not just the barn. The hayloft. The winter feed. Their only chance at making it through the season. Lily woke with a start as Toby bolted upright, his boyish bravado crumbling into something raw and terrified. Jed didn't speak. He didn't need to. The Colt was in his hand before Ellie could blink, his other already reaching for the Winchester. Ellie didn't hesitate. She yanked the cast iron from its hook, still warm from breakfast, and thrust it into Toby's shaking hands. "You know where the well is." Her voice was steel wrapped in calico. "Start filling buckets." As she turned to follow Jed into the hellish glow, she caught the exact moment Lily's fingers tightened around Sparrow's mended arm. Not in fear, in fury. The little girl's whisper cut through the chaos like a knife. "Make 'em pay, Pa." And with the barn burning behind them, they stepped into the fight. The world didn't end with shouts. It ended with action. Jed had his boots and rifle in hand before the second spark hit the hay, but Ellie was already moving, dragging water buckets across the porch with a clatter that split the night. "East wall's going up fast," she snapped, thrusting a sloshing pail into his chest. They ran toward the inferno, the heat hitting them like a physical blow. Flames clawed up the barn's dry timbers, popping like gunfire, painting their faces in hellish orange. Jed cursed, but Ellie was already swinging not with water, but with the shovel she'd snatched from beside the coop, beating back the fire's edge like she was fighting a living thing. "Swing like you mean it, McAllister," she growled between strikes. He answered by dousing the flames nearest the tack room water, hissing into steam. Behind them, the cabin door banged open. Toby stood framed in lantern light, his jaw set, the yellow glow trembling in his grip, but holding steady. Lily peered from behind him, Sparrow's stitched arm pressed to her mouth. "Hold that light high, son," Ellie barked, never breaking rhythm with her shovel. Show us where the devil's biting next." The boy stepped forward just one step, but it was enough. The fire roared back, licking at the rafters, but Ellie and Jed moved as one. Bucket after bucket, swing after swing. Every time Jed thought she'd falter, Ellie dug in harder. Her skirts blackened with soot sweat cutting rivers through the grime on her face. "Most women would be halfway to town by now," Jed muttered as they flanked a stubborn flare-up. Ellie's shovel came down like an axe. "Most women don't know what's worth burning for." When the last ember died beneath their boots, the barn stood charred, but standing. Jed's hands shook not from exhaustion, but fury. This was no accident. The stench of coal oil clung to the scorched earth. Silver Star's calling card. "I should have doesn't put out fires." Ellie cut in, leaning on her shovel like a warrior on a sword. Her breath came ragged, but her eyes were cold as a gunslinger's. "Only thing that matters is what you do next." Jed's glare could have melted iron, but Ellie didn't back down. She stepped closer, close enough for him to see the blisters rising on her palms. "You want to keep them safe?" She jerked her chin toward the kids. "Then quit looking for who to blame and start planning how we burn them back." A beat passed. The wind carried the scent of scorched wood and something fiercer, resolve. Behind them, Lily let out a whimper, her small fingers clutching Sparrow so tight the stitches strained. Ellie turned without another word. She crossed the yard, knelt in the dirt, and took the doll's hand in her own. "See that little Sparrow?" She ran a thumb over the mended seam, still holding strong. "Takes more than fire to break what's been fixed right." And as the first gray light touched the horizon, Jed McAllister made a decision. He picked up the shovel. The embers had barely cooled when Ellie knelt beside Lily, wiping soot from the girl's face with the hem of her apron. "Fire's out, little Sparrow," she murmured. "Ain't nothing getting past us tonight." Lily's small hand fisted in Ellie's sleeve, clinging like she was the last solid thing in a world gone sideways. Nearby, Toby stood rigid, but the lantern light caught the wet shine in his eyes. Jed moved past them, ruffling the boy's hair, a rough gesture that spoke louder than words before assessing the barn's charred bones. Later, when the adrenaline had faded to a dull ache, Ellie sat on the porch steps, stitching a burned harness strap. Her hands worked steady, but her muscles screamed in places that hadn't hurt since the night her father's forge collapsed. The creak of boots on wood announced Jed before he spoke. He dropped a folded quilt beside her without ceremony. "Spare room's yours if you want it," he said, voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Ellie didn't look up from her mending, but her mouth quirked. "Took you long enough to ask." The sound that came from Jed's throat wasn't quite a laugh, more like gravel shifting in a dry creek bed. But it was the first hint of warmth this ranch had known in years. The storage room smelled of dust and forgotten things. Ellie wasn't one for snooping, but the fire had lit a different kind of spark in her chest. As she shifted moldy saddle blankets, her knuckles struck something solid beneath the false bottom of an old trunk. The hidden compartment gave way with a groan, revealing a bundle of letters tied with baling twine. The top envelope bore a name that made her pulse jump: Clint Harrow. The handwriting was elegant, looping a woman's hand. The words inside cut deep. "Clint, they're back. Silver Star men, this time offering double the land's worth. Jed says to wait it out, but I see that look in his eyes, the one he gets when he knows a storm's coming. They've bought the sheriff. If they get the judge too, it's over. Not just for us, for everyone downriver." Ellie's fingers trembled as she unfolded another. Dates, names, payments made, and threats whispered. Jed's wife hadn't just seen the storm coming, she'd mapped its path. The kitchen door slammed behind her as she entered. Jed looked up from repairing a hinge, the color draining from his face when he saw the letters in her grip. "Those ain't your business," he said, voice dangerously calm. Ellie dropped the bundle on the table with a thud that shook the coffee cups. "Like hell they're not?" A muscle jumped in Jed's jaw. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, Mama wrote those. Lily stood in the doorway, Sparrow dangling from one hand. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Jed's shoulders slumped, all the fight gone out of him. Ellie picked up the top letter, her voice softer now. She was trying to save more than just this ranch McAllister. Outside, the wind moaned through the barn's scorched beams, carrying with it the scent of rain and something fiercer, a reckoning. Jed reached for his hat. "Saddle the horses," he said. "We ride at dawn." Ellie's finger tapped the letters spread across the table. "Your wife saw this coming clearer than you're seeing it now." Jed's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "This ain't your battle to fight." "Like hell it isn't." She leaned in the lantern light, carving shadows under her eyes. "You think keeping quiet protects them, that if you just take the punches, they'll stop swinging." The cup hit the table with a crack. "You think I don't know what Silver Star does to men who fight back? I buried Sarah in that plot behind the barn. I won't—" His voice broke. Ellie didn't blink. "You're burying them alive, McAllister. Every time you let those vultures steal another piece of this valley, you're shoveling dirt on your children's future." The silence that followed was thicker than gun smoke. Jed's breath came ragged, the anger draining from his face, to reveal something worse, terror. Not for himself, but for the small hands that clutched his shirt when thunder rolled in. "God damn it, woman," he rasped, dragging a hand through his hair. "You want me to ride into Larkville and start a war? I want you to stand." Her voice dropped to a whisper that carried like a rifle shot. "Because kneeling hasn't worked. Because your wife didn't write these letters to gather dust. And because those children deserve to see what real courage looks like." Jed's gaze fell to the letters to Sarah's looping script that still smelled faintly of lavender. Something long dormant stirred behind his ribs. Ellie stepped back. "We ride at first light. Clyde Harrow's still got friends in town. If Silver Star owns the law, we'll need every decent soul in that valley." The clock ticked 3 times before Jed exhaled. When he looked up, the resignation was gone. Just a slow, solid nod. Then, "Will you come back with us?" Lily stood in the doorway, Sparrow dangling by one arm. The question hung in the air like a prayer. Ellie knelt, her calloused fingers brushing the girl's cheek. "If this ranch is still standing when the smoke clears," she said softly, "I'll be here." Lily's tiny hand closed around Ellie's thumb, sticky with jam and desperate with hope. Behind them, Jed watched something shifting in his face. Not gratitude, not yet, but the first spark of something that had been dead too long. That night, as Ellie rolled her spare shirt into a bedroll, the wind carried the scent of coming rain. And something else. Reckoning. Ellie's saddlebags held only what mattered: her father's leather stitching kit, the Bowie knife her late husband had carried at Shiloh, and those damning letters that smelled of lavender and unfinished business. Outside, the rhythmic scrape of steel on whetstone told her Jed was preparing in his own way. She noticed how his hands, once shaky with suppressed rage, now moved with deadly precision. Larksville hadn't changed. Same sun-bleached sign creaking over the mercantile. Same pockmarked road leading past the blacksmith's to the saloon where the whiskey was watered, but the secrets ran pure. Yet the town felt different, not in its bones, but in its breath. The kind of quiet that comes when good people stop talking. Fern's eatery smelled of bacon grease and tension so thick you could serve it on a plate. Ellie dismounted, first her boots hitting dirt with deliberate calm. Through the window, she saw him, Reuben Stroud, crisp as a new dollar bill, flanked by 2 hired guns with the lazy arrogance of men who'd never worked an honest day. His polished boots gleamed against the scarred floorboards like a snake's belly. Jed moved beside her, silent but radiating warning. Ellie didn't care. She strode straight through that door like Judgment Day spurs ringing with each step. "Morning, Mr. Stroud," she announced, voice slicing through the clatter of forks. "Heard you've been buying up land. Thought we'd discuss the price." Stroud's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Dawson, didn't expect you to come riding into my office. This ain't your office." Ellie planted her hands on his table, making the coffee cups jump. "It's Fern's place. And last I checked, free men still eat here." A murmur rippled through the room. At the counter, old man Pritchett stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Behind the pie case, Fern's fingers crept toward the shotgun beneath the register. Stroud dabbed his lips with a linen napkin. "Now let's Ellie cut in, turning to face the crowded room. "How many of you got offers from Silver Star? How many woke up to find your fences cut or your stock scattered?" Her gaze swept over faces she knew: the baker whose son disappeared last spring, the widow whose deeds suddenly had clerical errors. "They took my barn yesterday. Tomorrow it could be your home." A chair screeched as Hank Muller stood up, his flour-dusted apron trembling. Down the counter, the postmaster's wife clutched her shawl tighter. Stroud's smile turned venomous. "Careful, Mrs. Dawson. Slander's a crime." Ellie reached into her coat and slapped Sarah McAllister's letters onto the table. "So's conspiracy to commit murder. Ask Sheriff Dunn about the night Clint Harrow disappeared if you can find his body." The room went dead silent. Somewhere in the back, a glass hit the floor. Jed's hand brushed his Colt, not drawing, just remembering it was there. And in that heartbeat before the storm broke, Ellie saw the first crack in Stroud's polished armor. A twitch at his temple, a too-quick blink. The reckoning had begun. Ellie didn't blink as Stroud's polished smile turned venomous. "You're peddling fear, Mrs. Dawson." "Good," she fired back. "Maybe it's time you tasted some." The door creaked like a gallows rope, and every head turned. Clyde Harrow stood framed in sunlight, leather-stained hands gripping his oak cane like it was a rifle. "Got Sarah McAllister's letters right here," he announced, voice rasping like a saw on dry wood. Names, dates, even how much silver changed hands at the mayor's poker game. Stroud's coffee cup hit the saucer with a clatter. Ellie pressed her advantage. "They took Cactus Bend last month, bought the sheriff, poisoned the wells, then picked the bones clean. You think you're safe because you signed their papers. Ask the widow Jenkins how safe she feels." A chair scraped near the window. Sheriff Penrose stood in the corner, his badge tarnished, but still pinned straight. Stroud turned to him with oil-slick confidence. "Sheriff, these good people seem confused about who keeps the peace here." Penrose's knuckles whitened on his belt. His gaze swept the room, Fern's iron grip on her skillet, Clyde's stubborn stance, Jed's quiet fury radiating like heat from a branding iron. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man waking from a long sleep. "My job's to protect the people who built this town, not the vultures circling it." The silence that followed was louder than gunfire. Fern slammed her cast-iron skillet onto the counter with a sound like a gavel. Down the line, Hank Muller stood, flour-dusted fists clenched. One by one, the townspeople rose: the blacksmith, the schoolmarm, even old Doc Pritchett, with his arthritic hands braced on the table. Stroud's polished facade cracked. "This isn't over," he hissed, straightening his coat with a jerk. Ellie stepped into his path, close enough to smell the bay rum on his collar. "It is for today." As the syndicate men retreated, something electric crackled through the room. Jed moved beside Ellie, his shoulder brushing hers. "That was a hell of a play," he murmured. She adjusted her sun-faded shawl. Just reminded them what they already knew. Across the diner, Clyde caught Jed's eye and jerked his head toward the back. "Shop's open. We got plans to make." The murmur that rose wasn't the fearful whispering of, before it was the sound of a town shaking off its chains. Silver Star had lost more than a battle today. They'd lost the illusion that Larksville would break. And in the corner, little Lily McAllister, who'd slipped in unnoticed, clutched Sparrow tight and smiled, for the first time in months. The ranch looked different in the dawn light, not fixed, but fighting back. Jed hauled fresh-cut timber across the yard, his shoulders squared with a purpose that hadn't been there yesterday. Behind him, Toby dragged a coil of rope, nearly as big as he was, his face set in the same stubborn line as his father's. Ellie stood by the workbench sleeves, rolled past her elbows, hammer already in hand. The barn's charred skeleton didn't intimidate her anymore. Today it looked like something they could beat. Lily perched on a hay bale Sparrow, tucked under one arm, her small face serious as she watched Jed's hammer fall with steady precision. When Toby finally wrestled the stubborn stall latch into place, the boy's triumphant whoop echoed across the yard. Jed didn't praise him, just nodded and tossed him a peppermint from his pocket. The unspoken good job made Toby stand taller than any speech could have. By noon the barn stood straighter, its fresh pine bones smelling of sap and second chances. The repaired gate swung smooth on new hinges, and the fence line stood tall again. Not perfect, but holding. That night the kitchen smelled of venison stew and hearth-baked bread. The table still wobbled, the plates still bore their chips, but no one cared. Lily sat pressed against Ellie's side, silent until the last bite was cleared. Then, "Mama." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Ellie's hands froze around her coffee cup. Across the table, Jed went still as stone. Slowly, Ellie reached out and tucked a stray curl behind Lily's ear. "Reckon that makes Sparrow part of the family, too," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. Lily's answering smile could have lit up the territory. Toby pretended to gag. "Girls," he muttered, but his eyes shone. Jed leaned back in his chair, his gaze locking with Ellie's. For once, his usual mask was gone. "Sign out front needs repainting," he said quietly. "Figured we'd make it official. 4 names instead of 3. Ellie didn't smile. She didn't need to. "Long as you're ready to explain to the Larksville gossips why the meanest cuss in the territory married a woman who outshoots him." The sound Jed made wasn't quite a laugh, more like a man finally setting down a burden he'd carried too long. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and turned earth. The lanterns burned brighter that night, their glow spilling across the porch where the new sign would hang. McAllister Ranch, all 4 of them. The last light of day was fading when the sound of wagon wheels broke the evening quiet. Ellie stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, just as the first lantern came into view, Fern Delgado leading the procession with that no-nonsense stride of hers. Behind her came Clyde Harrow, shouldering a ladder that had seen better days, and half of Larksville besides. No speeches were made. None were needed. Fern simply thrust a lantern into Ellie's hands. "Figured y'all could use some light," she said, as if showing up with half the town in tow was an everyday occurrence. Toby was the first to move, snatching a lantern and darting toward the gate. Jed followed, hanging another from the porch beam with hands that didn't hesitate. One by one the ranch came alive, lanterns blooming along fence posts by the barn doors, even in the gnarled oak by the corral. The glow turned the weathered boards golden, the light flickering against Lily's awestruck face as she clutched Sparrow to her chest. When the last neighbor had gone, and the night settled around them, the McAllisters sat on the porch, all 4 of them. Jed's arm rested along the back of Ellie's chair, easy as you please. Ellie leaned forward, watching the lanterns sway, their light painting the dirt road amber. Toby fidgeted with a length of rope, already planning tomorrow's repairs, while Lily dozed against Ellie's shoulder, her breath warm through the thin fabric of Ellie's shirt. The house still creaked. The land still fought back. But the emptiness was gone, replaced by something sturdier than timber, brighter than lantern light. Some families are born. Others are built knuckle by calloused, knuckle stitch by stubborn stitch. The kind that don't come easy, but hold fast when the storms hit. Ellie Dawson hadn't come to the McAllister Ranch looking for shelter. She'd come to build it for the motherless children, for the wounded man who'd forgotten how to let people in, and most of all for herself. Not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who knew how to turn scorched earth into something worth calling home. As the lanterns burned against the gathering dark, their light reached further than anyone expected down the road across the valley, all the way to Silver Star's polished offices, where Reuben Stroud stood at his window, watching the distant glow where one ranch had become a beacon. The message was clear: the West might be wild, but it belonged to those willing to fight for it. And fight they would. Silence won't save what's yours in this country. Jed McAllister learned that the hard way. The Silver Star Syndicate wasn't just some gang of thieves. They were the living fear that keeps honest folks awake at night, the kind that scrapes away names from deeds and memories from towns, until there's nothing left but dust and forgetting. Toby and Lily, those kids, carried the whole frontier in their small bones. Too young to remember their mother's voice clear, but old enough to know when someone meant to stay. They didn't need pretty words. They needed hands that didn't flinch when the fire came, boots that kept walking toward trouble instead of away. That ranch wasn't much to look at: weathered boards, a barn that still smelled of smoke, a fence line that had seen better days. But under those patched-up roofs and behind those mended walls beat something the syndicate could never burn away. A truth as old as the West itself: broken things don't need to be perfect to matter. They just need someone stubborn enough to keep fitting the pieces together. Family out here ain't about the blood in your veins. It's about the dirt under your nails and the folks who stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the wind howls cold. The strongest homes weren't built with fresh-cut timber or store-bought nails, but with splintered hands and hearts that refuse to quit. So if you're the kind who knows the West wasn't just made at the end of a gun, but in the quiet moments, a widow's hand on a child's shoulder, a rancher's nod across a lantern-lit yard, the way a whole town can rise up when one family plants their feet, then you understand what really built this country. There's always another story waiting, where the dust settles and the horizon stretches wide, where every knock at the door could be trouble, or it could be the beginning of something worth fighting for. So pull up a chair, partner. The fire's still burning, and the night's got more tales to tell.